Before I start, I wanted to thank Nikki from the Art Museum again for the chance that we can be here and all the work she's doing for setting things up. And this is really very much appreciated, and we love being here. It's a very fitting setting, and I'd like to express my appreciation. Thanks so much. Well, we have Jon Piccini here today to talk about issues of human rights and visibility. He's a UQ postdoctoral fellow here in history, and that's one of the, I think, beauties we have in our program. We come from various disciplines. I'm from political science, we have historians, we have art historians, we have people from anthropology, and to me that's sort of what interesting research is all about, is to explore things beyond our kind of departmental structures and binders and do things in ways that we wouldn't do otherwise. Jon has a book out on transnational protest in Australia, and this talk, I understand, is from an ongoing book that he has under contract with Cambridge about visibility and human rights and questions of activism in the context of Australia. But I shut up, I think. I better hand over to Jon, and we have, same rule as always, we have about half an hour maximum so that we have plenty of time afterwards for constructive discussions and dialogue and engagements.
Lovely. Thanks, Roland. Thanks for inviting me. It's a great seminar series, and hopefully this talk, which is from, as Roland mentioned, a bit of a different disciplinary perspective, will speak to themes that are of interest to everyone. So basically, what I want to do is just, as Roland said, this is based on some preliminary findings based on a book that I'm writing at the moment for Cambridge, which is due out next year, hopefully, depending on how that timeline goes. But basically, visibility, I'd venture, is not only a central concern of this seminar series, but of the contemporary human rights movement in general. From days of visibility to detailed reports on prisoners of conscience languishing in distant jails, the contemporary human rights imagination is redolent with imagery of tortures shone into the dark corners of the international imagination. Amnesty International, their famous candle logo, is imbued not only with the Catholic redemptive connotations of its founder, Peter Bennett, but the promise of illumination in those places the powers that be would rather kept hidden. As Lynn Hunt points out in her 2007 book, Inventing Human Rights, invoking sympathy through written or pictorial methods of visualization was central to campaigns seeking the abolition of slavery in the American South and the British Empire. Such early, if contested by contemporary scholars, examples of human rights commingled with the rise of global humanitarian organizations, such as the Anti-Slavery Society, and the arrival of photography and the magic lantern to produce international communities of feeling. Jane Lydon, in particular, has woven the history of photography with that of early Indigenous activism and awareness in the Australian context. Contemporary scholars question the unthinking assumptions, or at worst active biases and agendas, behind who is rendered visible and why. As Wendy Hesford put it in her 2011 work, Spectacular Rhetorics, the history of human rights can be told as a history of selective and differential visibility, which has positioned certain bodies, populations, and nations as objects of recognition, and granted others the power and means to look and to confer recognition. In preparing my monograph, titled Human Rights in 20th Century Australia, so a very small and condensed topic, I find historical actors struggling with these very issues. Who is made visible and why? As well as the practical difficulties of shining human rights' penetrating gaze on individual and collective injustices that states often want kept hidden. Such narratives sit within the broader history of human rights' ever-changing meanings and relative levels of governmental and community interest and awareness. Today I want to look at several examples from my ongoing project to explore the politics and practice of visibility and conclude with some thoughts regarding the usability of visual narratives to the contemporary rights movement. First, it's necessary to highlight that my project takes its serious analytical terrain the period after World War II. This is not to say that rights or visual empathy do not exist prior to this moment, as I've already discussed, only to argue that the United Nations in its codification of what is perceived as either age-old truths or newfangled nonsense, depending on one's perspective, augured the final realization of an international community to which claims for rights could be made. Yet, as Samuel Moyne and others have persuasively argued, human rights talk in the 1940s had little space for the individual. As he puts it, quote, "The vision of a post-war collective life in which personal freedoms could fit with more widely circulating promises of some sort of social democracy predominated. Only rarely," Moyne continues, "were human rights understood as a departure from the persistent framework of nation-states that would provide that basic life." Australian Attorney General Herbert V. Evatt, pictured here. His role in crafting the UDHR is well known, yet his specific policy objectives of arguing for the right to full employment and ever-growing standards of living seemingly clashed with a desire to ensure that what he termed, quote, "matters which under international law fall essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of states, such as migration policy, would not be a concern for the new organisation." This is not to say that the Declaration's moral force was not appreciated, merely that it was directed to the problems of war and collective injustice at the level of the nation, not national minorities or beleaguered individuals, unless those national minorities fit within the very specific meaning of a mandate territory, as the League of Nations defined it, and then a trusteeship territory, as the United Nations defined it. Western Australian Indigenous rights campaigner Mary Bennett wrote presciently to the London-based Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society, formed out of a 1909 merger between the Anti-Slavery Society and the Aborigines Protection Society. She wrote, "Is this abominable cruelty to women and children," referring to the removal of children in Western Australia, of Aboriginal children, "to continue because Australia is shielded from any injustice by the UNO," as it was called at the time, "and claims its usage of the Aborigines is the domestic concern of a self-governing country?" End quote. The real limitations of the human rights system here are obvious to activists even at an early stage. The organisation will make little space for those like Bennett who, as she put it, hold that cruelty and injustice to one, capitalised, person is the business of the whole world to redress. You can always tell if you find a Mary Bennett letter in the archive, but she has this intention of capitalising particular phrases that are important to her. And while photography was central to the United Nations Global Information Campaign in the post-war period, overcoming barriers of nation, language and literacy, as Jane Lydon puts it, the modernist, progressive and global assumptions that underlay it limited any potential localised impacts. In 1951, a UNESCO human rights exhibition toured Australia, pictured here. It was designed to mark the stages along the road leading from caveman to the free citizen of a modern democracy, while its imagery presented the existence of a shared human family. Such conceptions of universality in fact undermined what we would now consider human rights as key objective, rendering specific examples of suffering unpalatable in a global community. No images of Indigenous Australians appeared in the exhibition, despite it being held in Australia, and indeed the only Pacific imagery that was included at all was a New Zealand Maori mother and child, designed to represent, quote, "the security of family life," which was a central aspect of the Universal Declaration. Australian governments were removing Indigenous children in large numbers at this time, of course, in line with a policy of assimilation that spoke in the same language as UNESCO's linear Eurocentric understanding of rights progression from caveman to modern citizen. And Bennett was one of the few Australians to publicly protest these. This hints at broader problems faced by campaigners for Indigenous Australian human rights in the period. The Council for Aboriginal Rights was formed in 1951, declaring its aims to help the Aborigines to win for themselves the liberties envisioned for all people by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the conditions for advancement necessary for their very survival, as they put it in their founding constitution. Shirley Andrews, pictured here, who was a scientist, communist and nationally renowned folk dancer, she was a very peripatetic individual, as many of these campaigners were, was the council's secretary from 1951 to 61, after which she acted as its research officer. Initially, the declaration was used as an appeal to government as part of the group's letter-writing campaigns. As signatory to the declaration, the council protested in a letter to the Minister for Territories, Paul Hasluck. Aboriginal affairs in their present state left the Australian government open to justifiable charges of hypocrisy. Andrews, in another letter to the responsible minister, argued that Australia's Indigenous policies laid down very many years ago were, quote, quite contrary to the ideas of the times. particularly those laid out in the Universal Declaration. It is interesting to note here that Andrew's formulation here was that the Universal Declaration was a new idea for new times, not a continuation of an ancient legacy. Yet the seeming mandate that human rights gave activists proved illusory, as Hazlitt put it in a moment of perhaps surprising clarity in 1968, when he was speaking to a probably quite confused audience of human rights campaigners. The declaration was one, quote, that a nation would not mind having quoted against itself. This is a very long speech. This is just a quote from it, where he says human rights is useless and, we shouldn't worry about it, and he's prone to verbose pontification. The very universality of its promises made human rights a weak tool, in his opinion. It lacked concrete enforceability mechanisms to hold states to account. The gap between rhetoric and reality was starkly revealed in 1963, when Australia hosted a UN seminar on human rights and policing in Canberra. This was the fourth in a series of UN gatherings on the topic of human rights in the legal system. The head of the UN's Division on Human Rights, John Humphrey, praised Australia's hosting, claiming it had, quote, done quite a thing in taking the initiative in this seminar, which was to be, quote, one of the most significant human rights events undertaken by the UN. Hazlitt hoped the seminar would allow for views to be exchanged on concrete problems, and participants learn at first hand of the difficulties faced in other countries. The hosting doubled as a way that Australia, something of a pariah owing to its ongoing support for South African apartheid and discriminatory immigration and indigenous policies, could present itself as a participant in global affairs. To activists, Australia's hosting of the gathering seemed to offer a chance to publicise human rights violations to an international audience. And Andrews was asked to represent the Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society, who had observer status with the United Nations, so they could send along delegates and watch in on things. Andrews was an odd participant in these high-level goings-on, however. While open to the public, speakers at the meeting were to be, quote, ministers and deputy ministers, attorney generals, solicitors general, judges, lawyers, government officials, senior police officials and professors, with members of the public relegated to a spectator's role. Andrews remarked that it was not quite clear if there was anything in the program, which ran for over 2 weeks, where she could discuss Australia's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Andrews' initial scepticism was vindicated at the gathering, where attempts to speak were confronted with, quote, quite a bit of pressure, including a stern rebuke from Australia's Solicitor General, Sir Garfield Barwick. It would not be tactful to raise an issue that concerned only Australia, Barwick commented to Andrews at a morning tea before she spoke, when so many of the participants are Asians. Berwick suggested that they had so many more serious problems, terrorists, secret societies, etc., that the Aboriginal problem would be very unimportant to them. Berwick's unsubtle reprimand only furthered the institutional exclusion Andrews faced. The discussion was so technical at first that I was at a loss, she said, to see how material of a critical nature could be introduced to the discussion without appearing to be irrelevant. When Andrews was finally able to mount the podium, after effectively inserting herself into the program against the chair's wishes, she opened by criticising the seminar's overriding approach, noting the lack of, quote, ordinary human beings on the agenda, despite the protection of their rights being the topic of discussion. Andrews also railed against the dictatorial powers of Australian police over Aborigines, including neck chains and forced removals. As far as I am aware, Andrews remarked, Aborigines are the only people in the country who are liable to have their houses searched without a warrant, and to this effect Andrews brought numerous signed documents from Indigenous people in Victorian country towns who stated that the police are in the habit of walking straight into their homes without even knocking and going through all the rooms without any warrant or explanation. Yet Andrews bemoaned that such violations of human rights were not more widely publicised. As she put it, quote, the glaring light of publicity does not operate very effectively in these situations, particularly on reserves and missions, as ordinary people need a special permit to enter such places. It's quite evocative of some current Australian policy situations. Equally, police were seemingly above criticism. Andrews remarked of one recently retired senior officer from the Northern Territory who gave a frank interview to one of the Northern Territory newspapers, probably see no one to read it, where he boasted that he defied certain instructions, including the ban on neck chains, and had been involved in several inquiries involving ill treatment. he had what Andrews called absolutely no conception of the need for protection of human rights and would regard any criticism along these lines as newfangled nonsense. Andrews continued, yet until recently he would have been responsible for the training of new officers under him. Despite receiving quite a lecture from the Victorian Commissioner of Police for having caused him great personal mortification by mentioning these matters in front of Asian people, Andrews noted her intervention had, quote, received very good publicity. The speech caused rather a stir. Andrews wrote to the Anti-Slavery Society's Secretary Thomas Fox Pitt, being, quote, the really first controversial matter that had been raised at the conference. State police commissioners were present at the seminar and all made statements denying that the matters were how I had said. Yet Andrews felt that these statements were not very effective and it would have been better tactics for their part if they had just ignored me. One measure of Andrews' success is the media coverage it received. A reporter for the Canberra Times remarked how the audience sat in stunned silence, and one Singaporean delegate remarked that Andrews' testimony had left him bereft of words. What historian Roland Burke calls the rights, R-I-T-E-S, of human rights here seems a useful category of analysis. Human rights became an all-purpose lexical carapace, under which all manner of dissonant causes were pursued, as Burke puts it. High-level state functionaries from states as varied as Pakistan, Singapore and Taiwan came not to visualize individual suffering into these seminars, but to extol the achievements of their respective governments in what was then a shared diplomatic language. Andrews' annoyance and confusion at the lack of individual in the goings-on of human rights forums then cuts to the core of the term's meaning in the first decades of its life. By the 1970s, however, human rights seem to be coming into their own. The twin covenants that extrapolated upon the Universal Declaration's meanings gained sufficient signatures to enter into force in 1976, which, along with newly elected US President Jimmy Carter's morally focused human rights foreign policy in the wake of Vietnam, and Amnesty International winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977, seemed a crescendo of human rights' new enforceability and significance. Finally, it seemed the Declaration's promise of individual freedoms would be realized. And this is just an example of how human rights is used in the language leading up to the referendum campaign in Australia. Yet, as Burke points out, this moment of success that Moyne and others point to in the 1970s sat alongside other rights imaginaries. Quote, as human rights proliferated, its meanings pluralized, becoming the moral lingua franca, not for one world, but for conflicting ones. Now, two of these conflicting worlds collided in 1975, when a conference to mark International Women's Year was held in Mexico City, under the auspices of the UN's Economic and Social Council. Here, Australia's first Prime Minister's Advisor on Women, Elizabeth Reid, led a charge to make the specific nature of women's human rights visible in the organisation for the first time. So, see here the meeting room, the International Women's Year Conference Hall, and the slightly strange iconography associated with the Australian International Women's Year, which to me looks like the Millennium Falcon, but that might just be reflecting my specific interests. It was apparently a woman hugging a child near a moon, or something to that effect. It's very interesting.
Looks like the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, we can discuss this later. Yet, even in a year devoted to women's place in the global order, women's rights claiming had to compete on what seemed like a highly saturated market. Not only were there new rights being constantly codified, the right to self-determination in 1960, the right to livable environment in 1972, one of only two of many, but decades around colonialism, debates about colonialism and the right to development seemed to overdetermine all other discussions. Encapsulated in the Charter of the Economic Rights and Duties of States in 1974, the project for what was called a new international economic order promised to heal the wounds of colonialism by levelling a global economic playing field that was heavily weighted against emerging states. The International Women's Year Conference had the misfortune of being hosted by one of the NIEO's chief proponents, now Mexican Attorney General Guida Peludo, you'll have to forgive my mispronunciation, who was elected conference president, wanted to ensure that International Women's Year gathering did not become, quote, a forum for enumerating the problems of women faced in contemporary society, but instead adheres clearly to third world ideas of economic equality and development as a precondition for women's emancipation. Elizabeth Reed, who had beaten some 400 applicants for the position of women's advisor to the newly elected Whitlam government, came out of the burgeoning women's liberation movement in Australia that of course sought a very different approach, not of piecemeal reform, but the overthrow of a society governed by what the radicals called sexism. So like racism, sexism was a means, quote, of categorising people and assigning their social function. As Anne Summers put it in her deeply influential 1975 work, Damned Whores and God's Police. Sexism describes a set of assumptions about the world, which are then imposed on the world, she says. Inculcated from birth, when a person is defined as a male or female based on physical attributes alone, sexism, quote, divides up all the qualities a human being has or potentially has and says that women should have and be valued for half of those qualities. The official International Women's Year newsletter that Reed's committee put out announced that equality is not the answer so long as our society remains sexist. Equality would mean women becoming more like men. What is needed is for people to become more like human beings. I don't mean to labour the point on the definition of sexism, merely to elaborate what it meant in the 70s at this very specific moment in time, and how that's changed over time. These ideas were inspired by the struggle to make such issues as abortion and domestic violence visible in the national policy arena, and these were the centrepiece of Reed and her delegation's intervention at Mexico City. Whitlam and his Labour colleagues saw their investment in International Women's Year, that they put $3.4 million into programs, educational programs and seminars around Australia, as well as investing in this delegation, obviously, as a way for Australia to, quote, become once again a pace setter for the rest of the world in advancing basic human rights. Something that they felt that the previous Liberal government under Menzies and Holt and others had let fall aside. As the Prime Minister put it in his launch speech for International Women's Year, if we are to properly utilise our human resources, ensure basic human rights, and improve the quality of our lives, we must release the energy and develop the talents of all of our population. For Whitlam and, I'd argue, the protagonists in the new international economic order alike, it seemed the universal priorities of rights claiming and their subservience to the needs of the nation remained centre stage. So rights were about the nation more so than about the individual. Still, even in this period of rights' rebirth. The idea that women's human rights might require a different, more targeted approach seemed alien in this climate. Reed then had to walk a tightrope, and it's very interesting if you read her speeches at this conference, where she had to represent her government's human rights-focused diplomatic strategy, strongly put the case for the women's liberation movement, and do so while adhering to the ritualism of the new international economic order at the United Nations and how one usually spoke at these gatherings. So Reed's major speech at the conference's third plenary displayed a strong proclivity for this verbal gymnastics, seeking to place the concept of sexism alongside racism and colonialism, which were the dominant languages of the United Nations at the time. We must cease being afraid of these words, Reed told the assembled delegates, as the basis of racism, racial discrimination, alien domination, and the taking of territories by force is similar to the basis of violence against women, which we call sexism. The strong, if unsuccessful, push from the Australians to have sexism included in the final conference document reflects both the deep interconnectedness of ideas of the 60s, 70s social movements and the delegation's desire to blunt the edges of the dominant statist reading of development and rights at the conference. While acknowledging that economic rights are as important, if not more so, than political ones for women, and that consequently the demand for a new international economic order is far from a peripheral issue, as she put it, Reed used her podium to critique the conference's developmentalist agenda and try to keep its deliberation focused on the visibility of women. Reed suggested that women must not be forgotten in striving for a truly just global economic order or become matters of vague exhortation, insincere rhetoric, and token gestures, as she put it. Instead, their present oppression and subjugation must be recognised and steps taken to correct that. The Australians tried to use their experiences of Australia to argue for a more individualist position, that the discourse of development demanded by Western and now even developing powers, productivity and efficiency at any cost, must not make the personal a female trait and then deprive women of economic and political power, as had been Reed's experience in Australia. Instead, such thinking must give way to what she called new and culturally appropriate concepts of development that acknowledge the specific problems and experiences of women, including the poorest and least articulate. This is in 1975 that she's making these claims. The year had three slogans: development, peace, and equality, in that order. Equality, obviously not as important as the others. But she also has a go at these as well. The focus on peace between nations needs to give way to one of violence within societies, particularly against women, while equality, as we've heard before, was a limiting and possibly harmful goal. For while formal equality was vital, its mere existence, quote, will only encourage the belief that all problems are thereby solved. We can no longer delude ourselves that the hope of formal equality will eradicate sexist oppression. It would merely legitimize it, she argued, denying women the dignity and independence which are our rights as human beings. If, as Roland Burke argues, third world states deployed the international language of rights and solidarity to enhance the status not of the citizen, but of the sovereign state, then Reid and her fellow Western feminists sought the opposite: to present women not as obstacles on the state's path to development, but as individuals whose rights should be at the centre of global affairs. Reid's speech had indeed touched a nerve at the conference. One Australian woman who was present described how Australian women, whether official delegates or just other members of the delegation who'd been sent along, became recognised as a new force. Another noted that Australia was the only nation with the permission of the government to be honest about women's situations. Nearly all of the people who were sent were like the wives of like the prime minister of like Tobago or something. Like they were just, it was like an excuse to send them on a holiday, basically. So they ended up with like 90% of just ridiculous speeches. Despite their seemingly eminent status, the conference refused to accept sexism as an obstacle to women's advancement. It was not acceptable UN terminology, as one put it. While the Australian delegation voted for the conference's final World Plan of Action, one of only a few Western nations to do so, in line with Whitlam's foreign policy, they maintained strong reservations. So these two interventions by Australians into the formal UN proceedings show something of the difficulties associated with rendering visible oppositional politics within a human rights framework. Too often what Andrews called the glaring light of publicity proved difficult to focus on topics that either the Australian government or the international community saw as inconvenient or inconsequential. By the late 1970s, the Australian government had begun to recognise what we would now consider human rights as a central aspect of governance. Malcolm Fraser ran on a human rights platform in the 1977 election, promising the establishment of a Human Rights Commission, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and freedom of information laws. In 1978, was the first Australian commemoration of a Human Rights Year ever. The Universal Declaration's 30-year anniversary. Australia produced this human rights stamp, first time that Australia had produced one of the many human rights stamps that I've shown before, and distributed copies of the newly passed Racial Discrimination Act on cassettes in several Indigenous languages. Today, Australia presents itself as a leader in international human rights. Amongst the first to establish a National Human Rights Commission in 1981, Australia has just taken up a position on the UN's Human Rights Council, where we are supposed to play a leadership and educational role globally. Yet when one considers Australian human rights, the mind moves fairly quickly to the issue of immigration detention, particularly the offshore processing regime that started life as the Pacific Solution in 2001. And while these camps are often closed to journalists or visitors, much as Aboriginal reserves were in the 50s and 60s, technology means that Australians cannot avoid the visual reality of human rights violations now, even if the term itself has again become one of abuse in some quarters. The idea of human rights is certainly an unpopular one among some quarters of the Australian population. Much as photography and mass-produced fiction created global communities of feeling in the 19th and 20th century, the internet and smartphones ensure that no crime goes unrecorded, and a plethora of single-issue NGOs compete for the attentions of time-strapped consumer empathizers. Next month, Iranian journalist Behrouz Boushani will live-stream a keynote address to the Human Rights Law Centre's annual dinner from his cell on the Manus Island Detention Centre. So there's no real there's no real way that you can control this information anymore in the way that Andrews and Reed encountered in the 50s and 70s. It seems that what the world now suffers from is not a lack of access to evidence of global crimes, but their overwhelming circulation. Writing at the same time as Elizabeth Reed was haranguing UN officialdom over their ignorance of women, Susan Sontag noted in her work on photography in 1977 that the image worked not to lift individual crimes from obscurity to prominence, but instead to place them on a level scale with others in this age of what Walter Benjamin termed the mechanical reproducibility of art. For Sontag, individual suffering meant very little outside of a broader narrative with a wide appeal that extended beyond a simple humanitarian ethos to questions of everyday life. As Judith Butler comments on Sontag's formulations, if a photograph becomes effective in informing or moving us politically, it is only because the photograph is received within a context of a relevant political consciousness. It is to this very question of broader context and consciousness that the human rights movement now seems to be turning. Post-1970s minimalist readings of human rights are not enough, as Samuel Moyn puts it in his latest book, instead pointing to the need to recover the long-ignored tenets of economic and social rights that Evatt and the Socialist Bloc championed in the 1940s, but which were elided throughout the Cold War. It's only through a political program that renders individual struggles not only visible, but interconnected with those of others within society for a better life that the human rights movement has a hope of success in the present populist backlash. Thanks.